Hi, Julia. Welcome to Awards Buzz. Thank you so much for joining me.
It is my pleasure to be here.
I have so many questions for you. I'm so obsessed with this score. I guess I'll start by asking what kinds of ideas or materials you were given to start with. How do you even begin to dive into such a complex story musically?
I think it's a multitude of different things. Firstly, you have to honor what the vision of the showrunner and the director, Gus Van Sant, Alexis Martin Woodall, and Ryan Murphy, what they envisioned for the show. And then I think genuinely asking yourself the question, how can I help story, right? How can I help the buoyancy of Truman Capote? How can I help kind of create some sense of melancholy as it comes to the ending of so many of these friendships between these women and also between Truman Capote, mainly between Truman Capote and these women. So there was talk about an orchestral palette, and then you have to balance that with what does the timeline look like and what does the budget look like. So I think it's constantly bouncing between pragmatism and always trying to strive for making something as good as it can be considering the circumstances that you're in.
And your father, Thomas Newman, composed the main title theme. Did that come before or after? Where did it fall in the process?
So I think I was well into episode one. He was working on another film at the time. So they were the score and the main title sort of existed separately from one another. But I think what we wanted to do was have it feel like it was of the same world, but every time the main title plays, for it to really feel like this moment of refreshment.
Mm. Oh yeah, I absolutely. I'm just curious. I mean, this score, as I was listening to it, evokes so many things. I mean, there's something very hypnotic about it, which I find so interesting. But there's also like mystery and romance, and at times it even feels like it evokes like water, sort of a swan, going through. I mean, can you tell me about all these different influences and elements?
Yeah, sure. So I think the score began with establishing my harmonic vocabulary. And that was really just because that's what ended up coming first. It started off with these couple of dominant chords in an early scene in the first episode when Babe Paley is attending a Givenchy fashion show in Paris, I believe. And I remember my dad actually saying to me, he was like, why don't you take those chords and really develop that into a tune? And that's then where it is that I got the cello theme. So in beginning there, I sort of knew what it was that where it was that I wanted to start from a harmonic perspective. And that was simple in its vocabulary because it's really just solo piano and cello. But this story is incredibly complex. So I also knew that I needed to dive into the realm of psychology. And I think that's where playing with a lot of ambiances and drones, but then mixing that with a lot of live players became an incredibly useful approach for a show like this. Not wanting to abandon the more organic qualities that I had begun with, but allowing it to devolve into something more interior, more psychological. So I ended up using, everything from the EWI with this amazing player, Steve Tavoloni. It's an electric woodwind instrument, and essentially you can program MIDI, any MIDI that you want, whether it's voice, clarinet, oboe. If you hear any of those things in the show, that's I really owe so much to the brilliant Steve Tavoloni. And then I had the pleasure of working with George Deering, who played all of the beautiful guitar. One of my favorite pieces on the soundtrack is Borrowed Perfection, and he just did a fantastic job doing that. So I think part of it is understanding what your players have to offer, and as you're going through saying, how do I get the most out of my players, by looking at what's being required of me on screen and trying to bring that to the fore during our sessions.
Mhm. And I mean, this cast is, first of all, spectacular, but also very large. And so, how did you approach Capote, but also each of the Swans? Because I loved how each of them sort of gets an episode or a moment. And how did you highlight that musically?
I think a lot of it was starting with these broader themes. The first introduction of Truman Capote, it starts off in 1984, the opening scene of the show, and then we bounce back I want to say it's to 1968, if I'm remembering correctly. And you see, this amazing shot of Truman Capote's footsteps, in New York City on his way to Babe Paley's apartment. And, I had come up with this kind of 5/4 pizzicato something. And there was a buoyancy, Truman Capote sort of at his best. And so that was an interesting beginning point for me, but that's not the Truman Capote that you end up with by the end of the series. So I think instead of saying, here's a character, now let me be strict with how it is that I underline that character through score, I didn't want to be consistent. I wanted to watch the sort of dramatic downfall of Truman Capote. So, a lot of the material that I was using for him changed. Although when you get back to episode 7 and 8, bringing back some of those 5/4 patterns in pizzicato, because it's these dream sequences. It's Truman thinking about who he could have been and what his relationships could have been, but ultimately they never were.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to go next. You mentioned that a lot of the music was sort of inspired by changes in Truman. So how did you sort of capture the sadness? I mean, there's really some pieces in your score that are quite emotionally dark, for lack of a better word. So how did you sort of again manage to capture all of these different emotions?
The first sort of shift in Truman Capote's character, actually, for me, I remember starting when he's in the steam bath in episode 1, when he's meeting John O'Shea. And there was something, I think, that sort of tilted towards noir, with these kind of bizarre clarinet-y type of sounds that kind of undulated and curled, throughout that scene. But I think in writing that was my first hint as to where it is that I could potentially go. And then I think, the other scene that comes to mind, I can't remember if it was episode 5 or 6, but Truman is with his agent Jack, and they're in a park in New York City, and they're looking at this young couple in love. And I remember writing a tune there. I think firstly it was said that maybe it was slightly urbane, but then ended up coming back towards the end when you see in episode 8, when you see Truman burning the manuscript for answered prayers. Honestly, I feel like a lot of the way that I navigated this show was almost like a blind person kind of feeling my way through, trying to get a sense of the characters, because what does it mean to score something over an 8-hour period? How do you understand where Truman is going to be in episode 8, versus where it is that you're starting in episode 1? So I think a lot of it was reacting in real time. I mean, all of us know the feeling of losing a friend. I think particularly, as young women, friend breakups, come on. I mean, they hurt deeply. And I think I was thinking about those human experiences and trying to respond as honestly as I could in order to inspire a sense of collective feeling to the best of my ability.
I think that's why the emotion of the score kind of hit me the way that it did, because that's why the show, and all of this to say you're completely right. Yes, I agree. Now I'm trying to process my emotions while I'm like listening to you. Can you talk about sort of how the different locations in the show, obviously New York, as cliche as it sounds, is a major character here. Then we're also going to Paris, Truman is sort of bouncing back and forth as he struggles. How did these things inform your musical choices?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know that was immediately at the front of mind. Maybe the first time I really became aware of shift in location was when Babe Paley goes to her home. I believe it's in Squam Lake. Don't ask me exactly where that is, because I couldn't tell you. But it goes from her living this life, being seen at La Côte Basque, whether she wants to or not. There's a real visibility to these women. And, after her cancer diagnosis and sort of retreating, to her second home, where ultimately, I can't remember if she dies there, but that's where you know, her illness, she's devolving. Um, and there was a tenderness there. Again, going from being much more exterior, much more outgoing, to much more interior. And I think that that's a part of what the dramatic arc of this show really is. And so I took actually that cello theme, and when they're holding Babe Paley's funeral, and the fancy cars are pulling up to the beautiful estate, and what used to be cello now is a lonely oboe. And so I guess the shift in location to me became a lot about psychology and intimacy. Whereas something starting in a place like La Côte Basque, right? There's something, here's the cello, I'm making a statement. Because a place like La Côte Basque, you're there to make a statement, and the place itself is making a statement. And you see that in the camera work, in these gliding, panning shots, in the delicate lighting, in the perfectly the perfectly, what would you call it, in the food, right, in the perfectly prepared food. So yeah, I mean, I guess the same way that you go from New York to Babe's estate in Squam Lake, you know, from Truman Capote walking on the streets to New York to, you know, being confined to a rehab facility. I think, again, outgoing versus much more intimate and maybe self-conscious.
Mhm. And you know, the score has 28 tracks, which is a lot, significant. And so how can you tell me a little bit about just the sheer volume of work and how you put that all together?
That's a great question. Nobody's asked me that yet. It's a really tough thing to do.
Yeah.
Because you're writing so quickly, you're writing so much, you have repetition of material. You know, you've crossed your fingers that you've stayed organized, you know, in this. I think I started working kind of in earnest in January and finished at the very beginning of June. The first thing I did was make a master list of every single cue that I had written. And I think it totaled something close to about 3 hours. And then what I went through and I did, as I said, where is my thematic material repeating? And then what do I think are some of the best pieces? And then what I actually did, and this was something that I learned from my dad, who was so expert and so precise about the way that he puts his soundtracks together, saying, okay, when I was writing this to picture, right? Let's say I was scoring a scene where the women are at La Côte Basque and they're gossiping. Well, you know, if that's a 5-minute dialogue scene, maybe I really like this cue, but I don't need to put that. It's just sort of 5 unedited minutes on the soundtrack. So then it was a matter of saying, okay, what if I just took out 2 measures here, right? Because the difference of a soundtrack versus, you know, the score as it exists under picture is that sometimes I'm pulling back and waiting because something's happening on screen that needs to be respected and underlined by the score. Whereas on the soundtrack, the experience of it is something totally different, right? You're sitting and you're putting it on Spotify. And so the ear has a different expectation, because what's at the forefront of our attention is different than when we're watching something on screen. I think I did maybe like 4 or 5 different iterations of the soundtrack, of starting in different ways. It took me a while to start with that opening track, Dutch Master Daffodil, which I can't remember. It's either episode 5 or 6. I think they switched it. You sort of midway through working on it, so I get slightly confused. But it's at Galore Hat Shop with CZ Guest and Truman Capote, and that's where that piece came from. And it felt like it just kind of drew you in, and it was something that was kind of psychological and not at all what you would expect perhaps from a show about Truman Capote. And then it was all listening experience, you know, can we just be delighted? You know, I think that's sort of what you hope, that can you just be delighted when you go back and you listen?
Well, this is gonna be one of the soundtracks to me writing, so yeah, I've been listening to it a lot, and I feel like I'm just gonna keep coming back to it because, like I said, there's like something just oddly hypnotic about it, and I really love it. One of the other things that I really love in media that I consume is the idea of like the public life with the juxtaposition of the private life, especially with these women being so glamorous outwardly. So I wondered how you approach that in your music, and also like if your personal experiences informed it in any way, or even coming out of it, if you view, I don't know, glitz and glamour different. I certainly did, right? It made me sort of question what I see and sort of how I view people.
Absolutely. I think it's this question about the relationship between aesthetics and substance, right? What something looks like versus what something is. And those two things I think can exist in harmony with one another. But I think it's exactly what I found interesting too. Because look, there is something so fun about great costumes, about great fashion, about beautiful restaurants and exquisitely decorated apartments. I mean, it is fun. I think the problem is when that ends up taking up the entire picture. I think what I wanted to do was to create a real sense of depth and make the characters three-dimensional. What I noticed in watching the show was these are difficult people. They're not straightforward. And I remember at the very beginning asking myself the question, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? And I think I came to the conclusion that nobody's good and nobody's bad. It's just a really messy amalgamation of all of these human characteristics, right? Instincts in collision with one another, right? Because I think in a lot of ways, you look at a woman like Babe Paley and she's trying to survive, right? She has a husband who's cheating on her. She has access to so many things, but what does it mean to get Bill Paley's attention? To be in Jamaica hosting all of these people and know that your husband's, in the guest house with another woman. How do we survive that? Right. And survive it because like, look, I think all of us are ego-driven creatures, right? We want to look good on the most shallow of level. I think we want to be liked and we want to look good. And also, how are we surviving emotionally? And I always loved the line, and I named a cue after it, the hem of golden bells, right? Hem of golden bells, that Babe Paley would actually sew in bells into the line of her dress so that when she walked in, there was something angelic. And look, there's something profoundly absurd about that, right? But can we also make it three-dimensional? Not to say that she's good, not to say that she's bad. I don't think it's for me to say any of those things. I don't think it's for me to comment on complex people who truly existed. But yes, I think a lot of this show was these delicate handoffs between what does it mean to be fun and to feel New York City at your fingertips, the way we all have it in our imagination. And then to reconcile that with Truman Capote, who can't stop drinking and, who's hallucinating his mother coming back and criticizing him and, saying, take the drink. It doesn't matter. Just take the drink. You're a better writer if you do, and tapping into that insecurity that I think we all have as creative people of, am I good enough? Do I need something beyond self in order to just be enough? So I think all of that sort of psychological human minutia really, really interested me in this show.
I'm so fascinated by the way that you I don't know, think through your work and your relationship to your work and the relationship between the material and your work. How has the experience with your swans informed that going forward?
Oh, do you mean like how did this experience influence how it is that I want to kind of move forward with scoring?
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I like thinking deeply about things. And also, I don't think that you want to hear a composer thinking too hard when you're watching a show. I think that you want it to feel like it's a part of the fabric. So I think what I try and do is spend time contemplating, trying to understand these characters, trying to understand story, trying to understand, what my showrunners and directors are trying to get across. Spend all that time thinking and then sit down and kind of throw it all out. Because at the end of the day, we just want to feel together. When you sit down and when I sit down, even if we have totally different experiences, can both of us sit and sort of share in that moment of melancholy, watching this, once great establishment, Lacote Basque, and just sensing that there's just a twinge of melancholy, that somehow it's at the end. and how heartbreaking endings are, simply because an ending is an ending. So yeah, I mean, I learned so much. I learned so much on this show. It was such a humbling experience. What does it mean to write so much music, right? That oftentimes it's not like, wow, I'm sitting down and isn't it incredible? All of the ideas that I'm bringing to the fore. Sometimes, you've tears running down your face thinking all I need to do is just sort of survive until the end of the day. And I think that it's all of those things. This job, I think, as a film composer, can be the most glamorous and the most amazing, and also totally not. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that you get stuff rejected, and boy, did I get stuff rejected. You get accolades, and then you get a new cut, and this piece that you're so proud of and that you cannot believe that you were able to accomplish, suddenly there's a bunch of cuts, and okay, how do I approach that? So there was the broad strokes that I was dealing with, and then the minutia, the most glamorous moments and the most unglamorous moments of just a desperate young woman trying to prove her usefulness.
I cannot thank you enough for letting me pick your brain. This has been such a delight. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything else you want to mention before I let you go?
Just a deep gratitude that you enjoy the soundtrack. Truly, I spent a lot of time putting it together, and I think to just sort of say, hey, it stands up on its own, and for you to come with brilliant questions. Truly, I think to have it, something that you make, just mean a little something to someone. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much for taking the time
Oh
to
no,
talk to me.
oh my gosh, it means so much, not just something little, trust me. Thank you so much, Julia. I hope we meet again on your next project, where whatever it may be, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. Such a pleasure meeting you.